You were imprisoned, you said rightly, for doing your job, a job that we all here expect you to do, namely being a journalist. You investigated and you published your findings. But it is shocking to me and to many of us to see how long the arm of US justice is that can get a grip on you even here in Europe. And of course this raises questions that we will address tomorrow in Mrs. Eva Stottir's excellent report. But can I ask you a personal question? Were you aware before all this, were you aware of how little your basic rights as a citizen but also as a journalist were protected in Europe? And what, if I may add another question, what do you think will be the effect on journalism as a whole from your case? Thank you.
We performed a legal analysis to understand what the abilities and limitations were within Europe for publishing documents from a number of different countries, including the United States. We understood that, in theory, Article 10 should protect journalists in Europe. Similarly, looking at the US First Amendment to its constitution, that no publisher had ever been prosecuted for publishing classified information from the United States, either domestically or internationally. I expected some kind of harassment legal process. I was prepared to fight for that. I believe the value of these publications was such that it is okay to have that fight, and that we would prevail because we had understood what was legally possible. My naivete was believing in the law. When push comes to shove, laws are just pieces of paper, and they can be reinterpreted for political expediency. They are the rules made by the ruling class, more broadly, and if those rules don't suit what it wants to do, it reinterprets them, or hopefully changes them.
We're always monitoring threats to free speech, and one of them could be former Microsoft CEO and co-founder Bill Gates. Billionaire suggested an artificial intelligence program that would ban harmful speech.
We should have free speech, but if you're inciting violence, if you're causing people not to take vaccines, you know, where are those boundaries that even the U.S. should, you know, have rules? And then if you have rules, you know, what is it? Is there some AI that encodes those rules? Because you have billions of activity, and, you know, if you catch it a day later, the harm is done.
Speaking of misinformation, former United States Secretary of State John Kerry called the First Amendment a barrier to reaching the truth. Let's watch this.
If people go to only one source, and the source they go to is sick, and you know, has an agenda, and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, you know, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, you know, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change.
Now, there's an all-out attack on our freedoms currently being waged by Keir Starmer and this new Labour government, and the riots we've seen over recent weeks are the vehicle for their agenda. Brits are now being rounded up and arrested for things they've posted on social media in a chilling precedent that George Orwell would be proud of. Musk has goaded Starmer online, calling him a hypocrite over his alleged two-tier approach to the riots, while also suggesting the PM is overseeing a Soviet-style administration. In response, the highest police officer in the land seemed to bizarrely hint that Mr Musk could be extradited to Britain to explain himself.
From further afield online, we will come after you.
Talk to me about that, because we have seen some high-profile figures whipping up the hatred. You talked about it in there with the officers, in fact, about this being added to by online commentary. I mean, I'm even thinking of the likes of Elon Musk getting involved. What are you considering when it comes to dealing with people who are whipping up this kind of behaviour from behind a keyboard, maybe in a different country?
They want Elon Musk gone, X turned off, and freedom of speech stamped out. Starmer himself has said he's going to look at social media laws in the wake of the riots and even revisit the Online Safety Act. And right on cue, of course, the Westminster elite are now circling. Guardian columnists got their knickers in a twist, saying Musk should be on trial in the UK for inciting the riots. And Keir Starmer's champagne socialist biographer, Tom Baldwin, called for regulation of social media platforms, even saying free speech was not absolute.
There's a sort of silly argument sometimes about free speech, and Musk is sort of trying to pretend sort of freedom of speech is some absolute right. It's never been an absolute right.
Yeah, years ago, it was the little things, telling people to vote the day after the election, and we kind of brushed them off. Now we know it's intimidation at the ballot box. Mm-hmm. It's undermining the idea that mail-in ballots aren't legal. I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Walsh is wrong, of course. The First Amendment, which vigorously protects Americans' free speech rights, does not distinguish between good information and misinformation. Moreover, so-called hate speech, an arbitrary category, is as different people find different sorts of speech to be hateful. It's quite obviously protected speech, protected from government interference.
I sat down with Klaus Schwab, the founder of WEF, arguably the reason why we're all here. He warns that AI-driven misinformation is another huge risk.
If you take a 2 years outlook, fake news is the biggest risk which we face at the moment, because it can have enormous consequences for elections. It can change the context inside which we are living in the wrong way.
We should be, in my view, repealing something called Section 230, which gave platforms on the internet immunity because they were thought to be just pass-throughs, that they shouldn't be judged for the content that is posted. But we now know that that was an overly simple view, that if the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control.
He has lost his privileges, and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation, and that has to stop.
But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence.
And will put the Department of Justice of the United States back in the business of justice. We will double the Civil Rights Division and direct law enforcement to counter this extremism. We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms, because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
In the case of the United States, we angered one of the constituent powers of the United States, the intelligence sector, the security state, the secrecy state. It was powerful enough to push for a reinterpretation of the US Constitution. The US First Amendment seems pretty black and white to me. It's very short. It says the Congress shall make no law restricting speech or the press. However, that was that the US Constitution, those precedents relating to it, were just reinterpreted away. And yes, perhaps ultimately, if it got into the Supreme Court of the United States and I was still alive in that system, I might have won, depending on what the makeup was of the US Supreme Court. But in the meantime, I had lost 14 years on the house arrest, embassy, siege, and maximum security prison. So I think this is an important lesson, that when a major power faction wants to reinterpret the law, it can push to have the element of the state, in this case the US Department of Justice, do that. And it doesn't care too much about what is legal. That's something for a much later day. In the meantime, the deterrent effect that it seeks, the retributive actions that it seeks, have had their effect. Lawfare is the use of the law to achieve ends that would normally be achieved in some other form of conflict. We're not talking about simply litigating to protect your rights, but rather picking laws to get your man or to get the organization you want to get. Not justice seeking its resolution in law.
And will put the Department of Justice of the United States back in the business of justice. We will double the Civil Rights Division and direct law enforcement to counter this extremism. We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms, because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
But I think we should understand a bigger picture, which is that whenever we make a law, we create a tool that self-interested bureaucrats, companies, and the worst elements of the security state will use and will expand the interpretation in order to achieve control over others. It is a concern, and I can see a similar phenomenon happening with the journalists being killed in Gaza and Ukraine. That the political and geopolitical alignment of media organizations causes them to not cover those victims or cover only certain victims. This is a breach of journalistic solidarity. We all need to stick together to hold the line. A journalist censored anywhere spreads censorship, which can then affect us all. Similarly, journalists being killed or targeted by intelligence agencies need our firm commitment in writing or in broadcast. Sometimes there's a debate about whether someone is a journalist or an activist. I understand that debate. I've tried in my work to be rigorously accurate. I believe accuracy is everything. Primary sources are everything. But there is one area where I am an activist, and all journalists must be an activist. Journalists must be activists for the truth. Artificial intelligence is being used to create mass assassinations, where before there was a difference between assassination and warfare. Now the two are conjoined, where many, perhaps the majority of targets in Gaza are bombed as a result of artificial intelligence targeting. In 2010, I was living in Paris. I went to the United Kingdom and never came back until now. It's good to be back. It's good to be amongst people who, as we say in Australia, who give a damn. It's good to be amongst friends. I would just like to thank all the people who have fought for my liberation and who have understood, importantly, that my liberation was coupled to their own liberation. That the basic fundamental liberties which sustain us all have to be fought for, and that when one of us falls through the cracks, soon enough those cracks will widen and take the rest of us down. So thank you for your thought, your courage in this and other settings, and keep up the fight.